The air in the courtroom didn't just feel heavy, it felt like the weight of unwritten rules finally crashing down hard. The mahogany benches were filled with a silence so thick you could hear the heartbeat of the Republic. Then, it happened. A single sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the halls of justice, a sound that signaled the end of an era of untouchable arrogance. The judge looked down from the bench, eyes devoid of the theatrics that usually dominate our screens, and spoke 4 words that changed the course of American history. The claims are rejected. In that moment, the myth of the billionaire ghost evaporated. For the hard-working immigrant who started with nothing, for the families who play by the rules and pay their fair share, this wasn't just a legal ruling, it was a long overdue validation. News wires exploded instantly. The seizure of the iconic towers, the gilded estates, and the massive skyscrapers that once stood as monuments to an ego beyond accountability has officially been greenlit. This is no longer a theoretical debate about law, it is the physical manifestation of consequence. The golden keys are changing hands. For decades, he thought he was above the ledger, operating in a world where the rules were for everyone else, where numbers were just suggestions, and the law was a nuisance to be outrun. But 1 minute ago, the ledger hit back, and the foundation of an empire began to crumble under the weight of justice. This is the moment where the abstract becomes agonizingly real. We aren't just talking about numbers on a balance sheet or the shifting of corporate titles anymore. We are witnessing the symbolic collapse of a decades-long era defined by the illusion of invincibility. When the judge rejected those claims, it wasn't just a blow to a bank account, it was a hammer strike against the very idea that a last name can serve as a shield against the truth. For the millions of Americans who have arrived on these shores with nothing but a dream and a deep respect for the rule of law, this moment is a pivotal test of the American promise. We have been told for generations that in this country no one is above the law, not the king, not the commoner, and certainly not the tycoon. But for years we watched as that promise seemed to fray at the edges, leaving many to wonder if justice was merely a luxury reserved for those who couldn't afford to delay it indefinitely. The legal weight of this rejection is staggering because it signals that the clock has finally run out on the tactics of evasion. It is a declaration that the courts will no longer be used as a playground for the powerful to hide from their obligations. This matters because if the system failed here, it would have signaled to every hard-working citizen that the game is rigged beyond repair. It's about the integrity of our institutions and whether the scales of justice can truly find their balance when weighed against a mountain of influence. The world is watching to see if the architecture of our democracy is strong enough to withstand the pressure of this reckoning. But as the trucks prepare to roll toward the properties and the locks are prepared for the change of command, a deeper, more unsettling question remains. How did we get to the brink of a constitutional meltdown? To understand the magnitude of this collapse, one must first look at the foundation of the empire that is now being dismantled piece by piece. For years, the antagonist of this story operated in a world where reality was whatever he could convince the public it was. It was a career built on the bedrock of shadowy valuations assets that would mysteriously inflate when it was time to impress a bank and conveniently shrink when it was time to pay the taxman. This wasn't just business, it was a high-stakes performance of smoke and mirrors that relied on the idea that if you are loud enough, no one will check your math. As the legal walls began to close in, the strategy shifted from creative accounting to outright defiance. We watched a relentless display of arrogance that treated the American judicial system like a minor inconvenience rather than the ultimate authority of the land. Instead of providing transparency, there were years of delays, calculated diversions, and a barrage of defiant social media posts designed to whip up fury and cast doubt on the very concept of objective truth. Each court summons was met with a new set of evasive tactics, turning what should have been a straightforward accounting of facts into a polarized circus. The contrast became impossible to ignore. On one side, the imagery of private luxury, the gold-plated faucets, the sprawling golf courses, and the fleet of private jets, and on the other, a ballooning, public legal debt that remained unpaid and unacknowledged. It was the ultimate expression of a rules for thee but not for me philosophy. While the average immigrant entrepreneur struggles through mountains of paperwork to ensure every cent is accounted for, this figurehead of wealth acted as though the burden of proof was beneath him. He didn't just dismiss the court's authority, he attempted to redefine it, casting himself as the victim of the very laws he had spent a lifetime circumventing. This long history of dodging accountability created a sense of inevitability. The more he pushed against the boundaries of the law, the more certain it became that the law would eventually have to push back. The arrogance that built the tower was the same arrogance that forgot that every tower needs a solid foundation of truth to stay standing. Now, as the shadow of the gavel looms over those gilded hallways, the years of masterfully crafted illusions are finally being stripped away, revealing a reality that no amount of social media bluster can hide. Every epic conflict requires a moral center, a force that stands unyielding against the chaos of ego and the erosion of truth. In this unfolding drama, that role is filled not by a shouting partisan, but by the quiet intellectual rigor of the Dean of Conservatism himself, George Will. To understand why his voice carries such weight in this moment, one must look at a career defined by a steadfast devotion to the American Constitution above all else. For decades, Will has represented a brand of principled restraint that prizes institutions over individuals and long-term stability over short-term political gain. He is the personification of the spirit of the law, a man who believes that the true strength of the United States lies in its adherence to rules that do not change, regardless of who is in power. While others were swept up in the intoxicating noise of the rally, Will remained anchored in the quiet dignity of the courtroom and the library. He saw, earlier and more clearly than most, the danger of a cult of personality that sought to replace the complexity of law with the simplicity of a slogan. His journey is one of immense courage. It is the story of a man willing to be cast out of his own political home to protect the values that built the house in the first place. He speaks for the immigrant who looks at the American flag and sees a promise of fairness, not a tool for exclusion. He represents the millions who believe that being an American is about a shared commitment to a set of ideas, not a blind loyalty to a single figurehead. Throughout the years of escalating rhetoric, Will's critique remained surgical and calm. He didn't resort to insults, he resorted to history. He reminded us that civilizations are not destroyed by their enemies, but by their own loss of internal standards. His commitment to the decorum of our institutions stands in stark, cinematic contrast to the frantic, lawless energy of the antagonist. Where the villain seeks to burn the map if it doesn't lead to his treasure, the hero insists that the map is the only thing keeping us from the wilderness. This dedication to the quiet dignity of the courtroom is what makes his current validation so powerful. It is the triumph of the marathon runner over the sprinter, the architect over the arsonist. By holding the line for years, Will prepared the intellectual ground for this very moment of reckoning. He ensured that when the gavel finally fell, there was a philosophical framework ready to explain why it had to happen, not as an act of vengeance, but as an act of preservation. He is the reminder that while the noise of the rally is loud, the whisper of the law is eternal. And as the tension in the legal battleground reaches a fever pitch, it is this unwavering commitment to the truth that makes what happens next so inevitable. The courtroom transformed into a high-stakes arena where the air grew thin, and the traditional theater of legal maneuvering reached a frantic, desperate crescendo. On one side stood the defense, a team that had spent months if not years mastering the art of the detour, but as the clock on the wall ticked with a rhythmic, unforgiving finality, the familiar swagger began to crumble. They were no longer arguing from a position of strength. They were throwing Hail Mary legal claims against a wall that refused to budge. We watched in real time as they attempted to resurrect dismissed theories, grasping at technicalities that felt less like law and more like a plea for one more day, one more hour, one more minute of delay. They spoke of unprecedented overreach and political bias, their voices rising in a pitch that betrayed their growing realization. The bench was no longer listening to rhetoric, it was waiting for evidence. The judge sat there, a portrait of stoic patience, systematically dismantling each desperate assertion with the cold, sharp edge of precedent. Every time the defense tried to pivot, the court pulled them back to the ledger. Every time they tried to invoke the noise of the rally, they were met with the silence of the statute. The tension in the room peaked until it was almost physical, a palpable vibration between the marble pillars. The strategies that had worked for decades, the obfuscation, the intimidation, the sheer exhaustion of the opponent, were failing. You could see it in the frantic whispering at the defense table, the hurried shuffling of papers that no longer held the answers, and the sweat breaking on the brows of men who were used to being the smartest in the room. They had run out of road. The maze they had built to trap the truth had finally turned into a dead end, and they were the ones caught inside. The defense team looked at each other, realizing the floor had just vanished beneath them, and then the judge did the unthinkable. The judge didn't just issue a ruling, she delivered a manifesto that stripped away the gold leaf to reveal the rot beneath. As she began to read from the written opinion, the courtroom felt as though it were being vacuum sealed. Every word was a surgical strike against the wall of lawfare narratives that had been constructed to protect the antagonist. She spoke of the sanctity of the market, the necessity of honesty in commerce, and the fundamental principle that a lie told in a boardroom is just as much a crime as a theft on the street. It was a cold, clinical execution of a fantasy. The Hail Mary passes of the defense weren't just blocked, they were incinerated by the heat of documented fact. Then came the moment the entire nation had been waiting for, the intellectual killing blow, delivered through the lens of George Will's devastating analysis. Will, writing with the precision of a diamond cutter, stripped the situation of its partisan costumes. He didn't call it a political witch hunt, he called it simple, cold fraud. He argued that to characterize the enforcement of law as lawfare is to suggest that the powerful should have a permanent immunity from the consequences of their own signatures. The room went still as the judge reached the section regarding the assets. She didn't just order a fine, she ordered the seizure. Let that sink in. The very buildings that were meant to be symbols of an eternal dynasty were now legally categorized as the proceeds of a pattern of deception. The judge's voice remained level, which only made the impact more violent. She detailed the specific properties, the addresses that are synonymous with luxury, the towers that define the skyline, and moved them from the column of ownership to the column of collection. This was the ultimate mic drop. For years, the antagonist had used these buildings as props in a television show about success. Now, the law was treating them as collateral for a debt to society. The narrative of the successful businessman was replaced by the reality of the judgment debtor. George Will's words echoed through the public consciousness. Wealth that is built on the shifting sands of falsified ledgers cannot survive the tide of a transparent court. This was the moment where facts didn't just challenge rhetoric, they obliterated it. The audience watching the live streams, the reporters frantically typing, and the people on the street realized simultaneously that the myth was dead. The invincible hero of the deal had been unmasked as a man who simply couldn't pay his bills. The contrast was staggering. The quiet, unimpeachable authority of the bench versus the crumbling, desperate bravado of the defense. It was a victory for every person who has ever been told that the system is rigged for the elite. In this room on this day, the system proved it had a memory. It proved that while you can delay the truth, you cannot outrun it. The gavel didn't just close a case, it closed an era of impunity. The seizure wasn't just about real estate, it was about reclaiming the very idea of accountability from the hands of those who thought they had bought it. And as the final words of the opinion were uttered, the silence that followed was the loudest sound in the world. The moment the news hit the wires, the digital world didn't just react, it fractured. Within seconds, the hashtag started trending Seizure Day, and the ledger strikes back as a tidal wave of reaction flooded every corner of the internet. Outside Trump Tower, the atmosphere was electric, a chaotic symphony of camera shutters, shouting reporters, and a sea of smartphones held high to capture the impossible. News helicopters circled overhead, their blades beating a rhythm of urgency over a city that felt like it was holding its breath. For the millions of viewers watching at home, the split screen told the story. On one side, the frantic defensive spin from cable news pundits, and on the other, the somber, historic reality of legal notices being prepared for display on gilded doors. The political fallout was instantaneous. In the halls of power, the silence of some was as deafening as the outrage of others. Colleagues who had long looked the other way were suddenly forced to reckon with a reality where the invincibility of their leader was no longer a campaign slogan, but a legal casualty. The reaction of the world was split down a jagged line. Half the globe watched in a state of paralysis, unable to process the sight of a modern-day empire being dismantled by a signature on a judicial order. But the other half, they felt a profound, grounding sense of long-awaited justice. To the immigrant family who pays their taxes with meticulous care, to the small business owner who was once crushed by a corporate giant, this wasn't just a news story. It was a vindication of their entire way of life. It was proof that the American dream isn't a free pass for the few, but a commitment to fairness for the many. As the images of the seizure began to circulate, the shockwaves reached far beyond the borders of New York, signaling to every corner of the globe that the era of the untouchable had finally come to a crashing, televised halt. In the end, this monumental moment is not about one man, one empire, or even one specific set of towers. It concerns something much larger and more enduring, the survival of the American soul. For every person who has arrived in this nation seeking refuge, for every dreamer who believes that hard work and honesty are the only currencies that should matter, today is a homecoming. We are reminded that in this republic we do not bow to personalities, and we do not grant immunity to the loudest voice in the room. We bow only to the law. This is the great equalizer, the silent force that ensures the daughter of an immigrant and the son of a billionaire stand on the same level ground before the bench. Through this arduous process, a sense of dignity has been restored to our institutions, and truth has been rescued from the fog of rhetoric. We proved that our system is not a weapon of the powerful, but a shield for the principled. As the dust settles and the keys are handed over, the message remains clear. Buildings can be seized, but the principle of justice is what we truly reclaim today. The ledger has been balanced, and the myth of the untouchable has finally been answered by the reality of the law. What we witnessed today wasn't just a seizure of property, it was a renewal of the American promise. As the golden letters are stripped from the skyline, remember that our strength lies in our principles, not our monuments. History is being written in real time, and you are a witness to this restoration of truth. If you believe no one is above the law, hit subscribe and share this story. Stand with the truth.